Imagine, playing a really high-stakes game of chess.
Yeah.
Only instead of moving the pieces, every single time it's your opponent's turn, they just violently flip the board over and loudly declare checkmate.
Right.
I mean, it makes zero sense. You can't predict what they'll do next, and the actual rules of the game they've essentially ceased to exist.
Yeah, and according to geopolitical analyst Jeffrey Sachs, that image of the overturned chessboard is actually the most accurate way to understand American foreign policy right now. Like, we are watching the real-time disappearance of traditional statecraft.
Welcome to today's Deep Dive. Today is Tuesday, April 14th, 2026, and the entire world is watching a remarkably tense, rapidly escalating conflict with Iran. Traditional negotiations appear to have completely imploded.
Yeah.
And the United States has initiated a naval blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. And the sheer irony here is that this blockade is happening before a supposed ceasefire has even technically expired. So today we are diving into a comprehensive interview and analysis by Jeffrey Sachs, which was recently featured on the Glenn Deason program. We want to try and unpack his highly critical assessment of why this chaos is unfolding.
Yeah, his central argument is really that the U.S. government has moved away from, structured institutional bureaucracy into a highly volatile one-person show.
Right. But before we dig into the specifics of that diagnosis, I need to make a very clear statement to you listening right now. We are going to be covering some highly sensitive, politically charged content today.
Very much so.
This involves both left-wing and right-wing American figures, as well as foreign leaders. So we are not taking sides or endorsing the viewpoints of the original source material. Our job is simply to impartially convey and analyze the ideas, claims, and observations exactly as Professor Sachs presents them. That way you can understand the arguments that are driving the global conversation.
Yeah, establishing that baseline is vital, because we are looking at this purely as analysts examining Sachs' framework. And, he systematically critiques the current administration, the previous one, and really the underlying mechanics of American power itself.
So let's start with the immediate trigger of this crisis.
Yeah.
Sachs describes the daily unfolding of events as just completely nonlinear and, utterly devoid of transparency.
Right.
Just look at the dizzying timeline he presents. On one day, the U.S. is issuing public threats to literally destroy an entire civilization. Then, later that exact same evening, a ceasefire is suddenly announced.
Yeah.
And in the very next moment, Israel is essentially carpet bombing Beirut. It's total whiplash.
It really is. And the confusion surrounding Lebanon is, the perfect microcosm of this nonlinear chaos.
How so?
Well, you have a Pakistani intermediary stepping in and claiming definitively that Lebanon is part of the negotiated ceasefire. And Iran officially agrees to those terms.
Right, they say yes.
Exactly. But then Israel immediately rejects it, saying Lebanon is absolutely not included. And the United States, they just sort of, ham and haw.
Yeah.
There is zero unified front. There's no coordinated messaging and no apparent strategy tying any of these players together.
Which brings us back to the paradox of the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. Sachs highlights the sheer absurdity of the mechanism here.
Oh, yeah.
The U.S. originally objected to the concept of a blockade. So in response to that objection, the U.S. military started a blockade.
It makes no logical sense.
None. And the actual diplomatic negotiations, or whatever we even want to call them, are just as erratic.
Yeah, we saw the United States put forth a series of maximalist demands.
Yeah.
And Sachs really emphasizes that these weren't, starting points for a negotiation. They basically amounted to forced capitulation.
Right.
So in response, Iran sent back a counter list. And here is where the process completely breaks down. Donald Trump publicly posted that Iran's list, which was allegedly this 10-point plan, was an acceptable basis for negotiation.
Which sounds like a breakthrough, right?
You'd think so. But after that public declaration, the 10-point plan just vanished into thin air. During marathon negotiation sessions involving the U.S. vice president, this supposedly acceptable plan wasn't even brought up.
Wow. When a major diplomatic document just vanishes from the discourse like that, it signals a massive communicative disconnect.
Absolutely.
And Sachs points out a really fascinating psychological layer to this. He notes that the Iranian diplomats are acting very politely. They're utilizing traditional diplomatic phrasing, talking about, building trust and finding mutual ground. But the U.S. leadership genuinely views this politeness as sheer idiocy. How does that specific cultural misread actually drive the breakdown we're witnessing?
Well, it comes down to the psychology of an empire that relies exclusively on hard power. Sachs argues that the current U.S. strategy is built almost entirely on bluffing, bluster, and bullying. The prevailing assumption in Washington is just that they hold all the cards and can dictate reality. Therefore, when the U.S. administration hears expressions of hope or, diplomatic courtesy, they interpret it as weakness.
They think Iran is just folding.
Exactly. They don't believe in trust. They believe in force. But the tactical reality of the past few weeks has proven, according to Sachs at least, that the U.S. cannot actually militarily defeat Iran in this specific regional context.
So the bluster is essentially a facade masking a lack of tactical capability. You have an administration trying to huff, puff, and bomb its way to a solution, completely misreading the diplomatic signals being sent back to them.
Yeah, and the refusal to acknowledge that tactical limitation is why the negotiations look so disjointed to the outside world. The diplomatic levers have basically been abandoned for pure theater.
Now, when you look at this level of erratic behavior, it really forces a critical question, like who's actually writing these policies? Because flipping a chessboard and making 10-point plans vanish doesn't look like the output of a functional State Department.
No, it really doesn't.
And this leads directly to Sachs's core thesis, the deinstitutionalization of the U.S. government and the death of deliberation.
Yeah, the historical contrast Sachs uses here is really striking. He points to the Cuban Missile Crisis as the gold standard for how institutional processes are supposed to work.
Right, the classic example.
Exactly. During those 13 days, President Kennedy convened an executive committee that met constantly. You had the top minds from the Pentagon, the CIA, the Justice Department, the State Department, and they were fiercely debating every single move. They utilized daily briefings, highly detailed written memos, deep interagency pushback, and really active congressional involvement. It was this massive, deliberate engine of group decision-making designed to prevent a single point of failure.
But today, according to Sachs, that entire engine has been dismantled. Like, there are no files being carefully reviewed. The bureaucracy is entirely sidelined, and Congress is actively dodging its constitutional duty regarding war and peace. Sachs observes that representatives are just terrified of political retribution from Donald Trump, so they choose to duck their heads and say nothing, prioritizing their job security over national security.
Right. Leaving the entirety of American foreign policy in the hands of a one-person show surrounded by, well, sycophants.
He brings up a highly specific detail to illustrate this, which is just wild. During those marathon negotiation sessions, Trump was reportedly calling Vice President J.D. Vance constantly, completely bypassing normal diplomatic channels and the people who are actually in the room.
Yeah, it's highly irregular.
But I want to pause and challenge Sachs's premise for a moment here. Because for years, the prevailing narrative in American politics has been about the permanence of the deep state. You know, the idea that the CIA, the military brass, and the entrenched bureaucracy run the show in Washington, regardless of who actually sits in the Oval Office.
Right, the permanent state.
So how does Sachs explain this massive established machine suddenly just rolling over and letting one person dictate everything?
Well, Sachs tackles that contradiction head on. He acknowledges that historically, agencies like the CIA have acted as permanent fixtures. But the broader mechanism of the U.S. government is actually uniquely vulnerable.
In what way?
Well, whenever a new administration takes over, the top 6 or 7 layers of the federal hierarchy are vacated. Those are all political appointments. And Sachs argues that those crucial top layers have recently been filled not by seasoned professionals or career diplomats, but by highly unqualified amateurs.
Oh, wow. So we're talking about people who bought their way in through massive political donations, or individuals who are just like personal friends of the president.
Precisely. The deep state or the career bureaucracy only functions as a guardrail when the management layer above it actually respects the institutional process.
Right.
When you replace the entire executive management of the state with people who lack any professional experience in statecraft, you just short-circuit the whole system. The career analysts might be writing brilliant memos down below, but the people at the top of the chain simply aren't reading them.
Which brings us to the terrifying reality of who actually fills that void. If you strip out the seasoned professionals and sideline the institutional experts, someone else inevitably gets the president's ear.
Always.
And Sachs points to a deeply concerning inside account from the New York Times. And he stresses that this reporting has not been denied by anyone involved in the administration.
Yeah. The scene described in that report is really alarming. You have Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the chief of Mossad sitting in a small group setting, pitching a war directly to Donald Trump.
A literal war pitch.
Yes, and Mossad's specific pitch, according to this account, was as simple as it was brutal, they said. The top Iranian leaders are all scheduled to meet together in one location. Let's kill them all.
A mass assassination pitch formulated by a foreign intelligence agency presented directly to the president.
And the reaction of the American officials in that room is very telling. You have Vice President Vance, the director of the CIA, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff all present.
Right.
According to the report, they are highly skeptical. The top military minds view the plan as bordering on farcical. Vance reportedly states outright that he disagrees with the plan, but then he turns to the president and says, "I will support you regardless."
And Trump's reaction to a pitch that his own military leaders are actively questioning.
Allegedly, Trump simply says, "Yeah, this sounds good."
I really want you listening to sit with the gravity of that room for a second. You had the absolute top military and intelligence minds of the United States expressing extreme doubt. Yet the ultimate decision bypasses all of their calculus and comes down to a single rubber stamp on a foreign intelligence pitch.
It's stunning.
It reveals a chilling truth about the actual sovereignty of U.S. foreign policy right now.
Yeah, it is the ultimate danger of the one-person show realized. When systemic deliberation is removed, foreign policy is no longer based on a careful calculus of American national interest or, strategic logic.
Right.
It becomes based entirely on whoever has the most persuasive, emotionally resonant pitch to a single, highly impressionable individual in that specific moment. And Sachs emphasizes that Israel does not want a ceasefire. They want the full destruction of Iran. And they are successfully leveraging this non-traditional, deinstitutionalized decision-making process to just circumvent American military reluctance.
But realizing that world-altering decisions rest solely on one person's shoulders, it forces a really uncomfortable conversation. We have to critically evaluate the mental state of that specific individual. And Sachs doesn't shy away from this at all. He claims the current situation goes far beyond political incompetence, arguing that Trump is showing profound signs of mental instability. His exact phrasing is that the man has lost his mind.
He does, yeah. And he points the public record as evidence for this. Sachs references the late-night, completely unfiltered posts on Truth Social. We saw that bizarre attempt at public diplomacy where Trump posted, "Open the fucking strait, you crazy bastards."
Right, yeah.
He threatened that an entire civilization would end and never return. He launched random attacks against Pope Leo. He bizarrely posted an image depicting himself as Christ, only to backtrack later and claim the imagery was meant to represent the Red Cross, trying to dodge the PR disaster.
Right, I mean, these aren't carefully vetted press releases. They are unfiltered thoughts pushed directly to the public in the middle of the night.
Exactly.
Sachs describes this behavior as being 4 standard deviations from the norm of American history. It is entirely unprecedented for a sitting executive. But crucially, and this proves Sachs is looking at the system itself rather than just making a partisan attack, he compares this exact phenomenon to the previous administration.
Yes, he draws a direct parallel to President Biden. Sachs asserts that Biden also suffered from severe cognitive decline during his final years in office. He states that Biden wasn't all there and had similarly lost his mind.
Wow.
The stark difference, Sachs argues, was solely in how that decline was managed by the institution.
Right, because Sachs notes that Biden's condition was heavily shielded by a very small circle of handlers, his wife, and political insiders. They intentionally kept him away from his own senior administration officials until that infamous debate exposed the reality to the public. He even compares it to the historical precedent of Woodrow Wilson, whose debilitating stroke was hidden from the country by his wife in the aftermath of World War I. Think about it like a massive publicly traded corporation where the CEO is suddenly incapacitated.
That's a good way to put it.
Right. Instead of stepping in and replacing him for the health of the company, the board of directors quietly covers it up just to keep the stock price from tanking. It's a bizarre American tradition. Because the U.S. isn't a parliamentary system where a prime minister can be swiftly swapped out by a coalition vote, the instinct of the political apparatus surrounding an incapacitated president is just to fiercely protect their proximity to power and hide the decline at all costs.
Yeah, that corporate analogy perfectly captures the mechanism of the cover-up. And connecting that mental instability to the paralysis of the state is really vital here.
How so?
Well, when your sole decision maker is operating under delusions, acting on the genuine belief that a quick phone call will magically solve the war in Ukraine, or that he can personally handpick the next leader of Iran, the entire apparatus of statecraft breaks down. You cannot execute rational foreign policy when the foundation it's built upon is entirely detached from reality.
But we have to ask why this specific institutional breakdown is happening now. A single leader's psychology or a cabinet of yes men doesn't explain the failure of the entire system.
Right.
Sachs argues this is actually a symptom of a much larger structural disease, an empire failing to adapt to a changing planet.
Yes, the fundamental failure of the United States, according to Sachs's broader geopolitical view, is its absolute inability to recognize that it now lives in a multipolar world.
Meaning power is now distributed among several major global players rather than just one superpower dictating terms to everyone else.
Precisely. The U.S. is acting as a would-be hegemon. It has lost a tremendous amount of its relative global economic and military power over the last few decades.
Right.
But rather than adapting its strategy to build coalitions, it is flailing around violently to protect its dominance. Sachs points out the prevailing delusion in Washington remains unchanged. We are the USA, we have the most powerful military in history, we don't have to deal with anybody, they will fold, I demand 100%.
And Sachs highlights that this exact arrogant miscalculation has already happened repeatedly.
Yeah.
With disastrous results. He brings up China first. The U.S. assumed that implementing strict semiconductor bans would completely crush the Chinese tech economy. They thought cutting off the supply of advanced chips would force China to submit. Instead, China simply innovated around the blockade and retaliated heavily against U.S. sanctions within 2 days.
Exactly.
They essentially outflanked the policy and said, you can't win, you just lost. The European allies were stunned because the American assumption was always that China would just accept the discipline.
And we saw the exact same flawed script executed with Russia. The overarching assumption in Washington was that hitting Russia with swift sanctions would collapse their economy in a matter of days.
Right, and for context, SWIFT is the underlying messaging system that makes global banking work.
Yeah. So the U.S. assumed that cutting Russia out of that system would isolate them entirely, but they failed to anticipate the obvious mechanism. Russia just built alternative financial pathways and started trading with partners in local currencies. The Russian economy didn't collapse, and they weren't hopelessly beaten on the battlefield. Sachs points out that all of these American assumptions were incredibly easy to disprove with basic analysis, yet the U.S. based its entire global strategy on them.
Because the people running the policy simply don't know what they're doing. Sachs blames this squarely on deep-rooted political corruption. Money buys the office, and the result is completely unqualified people standing at the helm of global crises.
Yeah.
He specifically calls out individuals like Howard Lutnick and Peter Navarro, whom he describes as an utter incompetent leading a completely failed, illegal trade policy. He also points to Pete Hegseth as an example of this amateurism. Now, if you're listening to this on your commute or while making dinner, you might be wondering why you should care if some Washington bureaucrats get replaced by political donors. It sounds like standard internal D.C. drama.
Yeah.
But Sachs is arguing that this lack of expertise is literally what brings nuclear powers to the brink of war. Are we essentially watching the classic historical trope of an empire dying from internal incompetence rather than external threats?
That historical parallel is exactly what Sachs is drawing. If we look at the grand sweep of history, large empires invariably build complex, highly structured bureaucracies to manage their vast global interests.
Right.
But as those empires enter a state of decline, those very systems become slow, deeply corrupt, and resistant to reform. Ultimately, they get hijacked by elite competition and amateurism.
Which is what we're seeing.
Exactly. The U.S. bureaucracy, with its high turnover of political appointees, has always been slightly vulnerable to this. But what we are witnessing now is the total capture of that system by individuals who are, frankly, ignorant of the delicate mechanisms of global power.
Let's tie these threads together for you listening. The terrifying chaos we are watching unfold in the Middle East right now, the sudden blockades, the whiplash of vanished negotiations, the bombings, it is not a string of random disconnected events.
No, not at all.
According to Sachs's analysis, it is the direct, logical output of a deinstitutionalized American government. It is a system that has been hijacked by foreign influence and corrupt amateurism. led by individuals suffering from delusions of absolute hegemony in a world that has already moved on to a multipolar reality.
Yeah, it serves as a stark reminder that when global events move this fast and the stakes are this incredibly high, understanding the process of how decisions are made is just as important as knowing the outcome of those decisions.
Exactly.
Because if the process is structurally broken, the outcome will inevitably be chaos.
Leaving us with one final deeply unsettling thought to mull over. If the American presidential system is fundamentally vulnerable to this kind of one-person show, hijacking a reality where Congress completely abdicates its constitutional duty out of fear and the cabinet is filled with donors rather than diplomats, what happens when the next global crisis requires nuanced multilateral diplomacy?
It's a scary question.
It is. If the navigation system of American statecraft has been fully dismantled, is the rest of the world waiting around for structural reform in Washington? Or are they simply preparing to navigate around the United States entirely? If the guardrails are truly gone, a world that ignores American leadership might just be the new normal. Thank you for diving deep into the sources with us today.